This is Uncollared, off-the-cuff conversations between progressive pastors at the intersection of religion, politics, and culture. I'm Todd Leonard. I'm senior pastor at Glendale City Church. In a moment, I'll be joined by Shane Kinnison, senior pastor at First Baptist Church of Glendale, and by Aaron Van Voorhis, lead pastor at Central Avenue Church. Today, we're talking about religious violence, as we're seeing it take place by the Taliban as they retake Afghanistan, and as we've seen it in other iterations and other religious traditions. We hope you enjoy our conversation. All right, good to be together with you two gentlemen. We've been away from the podcast for a few weeks with all sorts of different things going on, but Shane, it's good to see you again, and Aaron, glad you're back on the podcast, and I think we've got some good stuff to talk about today. We're watching what's happening in Afghanistan, and part of that we're obviously watching take place, which is hard to see, is seeing the Taliban returning to their place of authority and running the nation of Afghanistan, and those of us who remember how they ran the country, we fear for what the effect will be upon many of the citizens of Afghanistan in the months and years to come. That specter of their return to power kind of brought us together around the idea that we wanted to talk today about fundamentalism and the use of violence and religious fundamentalism. And Aaron, this is something you're thinking about and planning to talk about with your community. So why don't you start us off?
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for having me back, Todd. And I haven't flushed out all my ideas about this yet. None of us have. That's why we're here, I guess. And hopefully we can have an informed conversation despite. So the two questions I'm wrestling with this week, as I think you guys are as well, is what is religious violence and what gives rise to it? Mm-hmm. Defining religious violence, I think, is way easier than defining what causes it. I think we can say that religious violence in general is defined as violence motivated by religious dogma, sacred texts, beliefs, and or religious leaders that claim to be speaking on the behalf of God, right? In short, religious violence, I think, is violence motivated, at least in part, by one's religion. That's relatively easy to understand and define. However, I think getting at the root of what gives rise to religious violence is much more complex, and is as complex in my mind as the people, the culture, the historical context, and the complex political, social, economic forces involved that always play a role in acts of religious violence, whether it's being committed by an individual, a community, or a nation. So, that's kind of where my mind is at on this. The other thing we have to, I think, kind of define here today, what do we mean by violence? Because the definition of violence is as complex as anything else, and it's not entirely agreed upon. What may seem violent to you might not seem violent to me, or vice versa. Is violence merely physical acts that harm the bodies of others, or can violence be emotional, spiritual, psychological? Can it be economic and social, in the sense of unjustly restricting somebody else's access to resources and opportunities? And I think so. I think all of that can be violent. I think violence comes in all shapes and forms, and I think restricting its definition to this kind of one-dimensional understanding that violence is just physical violence, I think that's very myopic, and I think that's usually a definition of violence employed and held by people in positions of power and privilege who don't want what they're doing labeled as violent. So I feel like those are some of the issues that I'm wrestling with this week. I don't know. We opened up a can of worms here today, I feel like. But anyway, that's how I think we should probably start the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's great that you've already kind of expanded the definition of what violence looks like, because so much of what To use an analogy, we talked to, the United States and the Soviet Union for many years were what was called a Cold War,
Yeah.
where there wasn't any actual launching of weapons or armies fighting against each other, and yet there was obviously great violence at work in both ways, and proxy activities taking place in other parts of the world and things like that that was not any direct action against one another, but these two global powers were exercising a force and a dominance over other people and forcing other people to behave in certain ways on a global geopolitical scale. And I think so, to look at that in the context of religious power as well, you can look at religions holding that type of authoritative, or not authoritative, authoritarian power over groups of people, and exercising it in ways where there's no actual beating or other forms of physical violence, but in fact is very much accomplishing violent intent
Yeah.
in another way. So I think that's very well said, that by expanding that definition.
Yeah, and I just want to add one thing briefly, if I may. Something that I've discovered in my own studies this week and preparing for Sunday is that, lots of research and study have actually been done over the years trying to establish a clear link or a clear relationship between religious beliefs and behavior. And the general consensus from social scientists is that there isn't a clear link. People's behavior does not necessarily directly flow from religious beliefs and religious values, because people's religious beliefs and values are as fragmented, loosely connected, and context dependent as all other domains of culture and life. So all that to say, we have to avoid saying, well, if you're a conservative evangelical or you're a conservative Muslim, then you're going to be violent in X, Y, and Z ways, or you're going to behave this way or that way. You can't really, we can't really draw those clear lines. And yet there is correlation between rigid religiosity and fundamentalism and acts of overt violence, spiritual, physical, and otherwise, right? So all that to complicate things, I guess.
I would weigh in also on that at this moment regarding radicalized faith and religious fundamentalism, where you're referencing studies whereby behaviors may not always be predicated upon belief. And that may well be true because of just the enormity of the diversity of beliefs and the diversity of faith and how it affects all of us. But what is it about radicalized faith? What is it about radicalized faith and fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, that seems to be able to streamline or to funnel various approaches, various belief systems, various points of order that would then move individuals and groups of people into more of a violent application of that particular brand of extremism? Dr. King reminded us years ago that truth is never found in the thesis nor the antithesis. It's always found somewhere in the middle. But when you push everything over to the extreme side and you radicalize your thoughts and you radicalize your beliefs and you radicalize your values and you radicalize your morality, then how does that energize toward that which becomes violent, whether it be, as you indicated earlier, Aaron, whether it be physical violence, bloodshed, death or mayhem, or other kinds of violence, verbal, psychological, group orientation, expectations, whatever it might be.
Which can lead to real death and physical harm.
Absolutely. So I would just weigh in also into the conversation the presence and the danger of radicalized faith and extreme fundamentalist religiosity, regardless of who it is. This keeps us from doing that tit for tat idea where radicalized Islam is very, 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 very bad, while we hold on to our faith, which is very, 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 very good. But to recognize that within all of our context, there is the place, there is the space, and there is the capacity for radicalized faith that can lead to violence.
Yeah, and if I can jump in, I think in order to get to the root of this, if it's possible to get to the root of it, and I have my doubts about that a little bit, because I think ultimately the root lies within the innate illogical nature of our own minds, frankly, and our own unsearchable depth, the unsearchable depths of our own unconscious selves to some degree. I think we have to go way back into, I think we have to dive into psychology and a little bit to biology as well. I don't think our species evolved, meaning Homo sapien. I don't think our species evolved to think logically entirely, not entirely. In some things, yes,
Right.
but I think we evolved to think tribally more than logically. In other words, we evolved as a survival technique to favor group cohesion, tribal cohesion over everything else. In other words, because that's what would allow us to survive and reproduce, etc. So in other words, religion, politics, the social framework of our tribes became, it kind of doesn't really matter what the actual dogma or beliefs or values or the particular doctrines, be they political or religious, really are, and they can be totally absurd, but if they function as a way of maintaining group cohesion and tribal cohesion, they were useful, they were utilitarian. And so all that to say, when I think about my own background in fundamentalism and how I actually, as growing up, even as a young man in my 20s, I love to talk about the end of the world. I love to talk about the end times. And I even got, I got some kind of enjoyment out of talking about the apocalypse. When you think about it, I was actually enjoying and getting excited about talking about, mass death, right? That the second coming and the great judgment. What could possibly allow me to detach myself empathetically from the rest of the world, which is totally unchristian when you think about it, but the illogical nature of those beliefs, and somehow, calling myself a good Christian or feeling good about myself while enjoying talking about mass death and the apocalypse, really that was all rooted in tribalism. It was because that's what my tribe did, and that's what it meant to be part of the tribe, and that's where I derived meaning and a sense of identity from. Yes, it was totally illogical now that I look back at it, but it was tribal, and that explained it all. And so I think a lot of religious violence is more tribal than anything else. It's not because the actors involved are psychopaths, that there's something pathologically wrong with them, because in other aspects of life, they're kind. They're probably kind to their children. They're probably kind to their pets, right? Why is it that they're okay with watching, their religious or political enemies suffer and die? Why do they take comfort in the idea of that those with different beliefs are going to burn eternally? That this is all driven by tribalism. It's not logical. I think it's tribal at its heart. And that's just the way our brains evolved. And I think that can explain a lot of religious violence. That's that's a quick way that I kind of explain it, but I might be wrong.
I would just like to add to that as well, that take on tribalism and the desire to preserve the tribe.
Yeah.
When you add to that base of the brain, that reptilian brain, that gives us our fight or flight syndrome, our survival instincts, our very base survival instincts. And you add to that this context of heightening stress, heightening anxiety, heightening fear, heightening anger and frustration and disillusionment, perhaps, that can create for a very dangerous cocktail.
Yeah.
Whereby being motivated in those parts of the brain, being motivated by such fight or flight scenario or syndrome or instinct or desire, and the desire to protect and defend the tribe at all cost in a cultural and community and country scenario of upticking of all kinds of anxieties. And it becomes the seedbed, perhaps, for the expressions of radicalized faith and fundamentalism.
I think that there's a certain level of catharsis involved in this as well, that fundamentalist religious systems are basically built to avoid a more direct confrontation with the world and the problems inherent to existence and life. And they supplement ultimately unanswerable questions with certainty and easy answers to religious platitudes and religious answers to complex problems. And so, it's not just tribal, I think, but the religious violence is there to preserve and to provide catharsis. I think scapegoating is an important word to use here as well when we talk about religious violence, because quite often the targets of religious violence are targets because the underlying belief is, if we eliminate this group, if we marginalize or oppress this group, then we will be granted peace. We will be, granted wholeness, whether in our nation or in our own, private lives. I think scapegoating, the mechanism of scapegoating as an unconscious mechanism, is also at work.
As we were watching the events unfold in Afghanistan on real time, I will tell you what I was experiencing personally. While watching the Taliban making their way toward Kabul, seeing the Taliban flags beginning to pop up and fly in the provinces, watching the people coming in on bicycles and motorcycles and ATVs and buses and trucks, bearing their arms across their shoulders and across their chests. In my mind's eye, I was watching January 6th all over again. I was watching the insurrection at the United States Capitol while I was physically observing the movement of the Taliban into Afghanistan. And for me, I see no difference. I see them as both the same, mirrored images of the same mentality, of the same philosophy, of the same fear, of the same control, of the same dominance. I see them as mirrored images of the same radicalization, being radicalized by maybe differing points of view, but radicalized the same nonetheless. So for me, as I was watching this unfold in real time on television, my mind's eye was all the way back to January the 6th.
It's interesting to see that the more fundamentalist, violent manifestations of religion are often tied to establishing that religion as the religion of the state. It's a theocracy. It's very much looking for theocracy. Whereas you look at the liberal progressive expressions of any major religious faith tradition, and you will see that the geopolitical boundaries become almost irrelevant.
I think another important thing to consider here, in comparison of American Christian fundamentalism and Islamic fundamentalism as seen in the Taliban, there is a common thread, and that common thread is chosenness, this idea of chosenness. This idea, specifically within the United States, and having grown up in it, I know it quite well, this idea that we are a chosen nation, specifically us white American Christians. We were chosen to settle this land. It was given to us by God. We were chosen to come here. White European Christians were chosen to come here to displace and subjugate the native people in the name of setting up a community or perhaps a nation that would glorify God and that would establish his ways on the earth. And that idea has that spiritual ideological gene has been passed down generation to generation in the United States, and was seen on January 6th specifically, and is what animates the evangelical right today, this idea of chosenness. And you see the exact same ideology, I think, present in radical Islam, specifically within the Taliban. I don't know, I have not studied the Taliban, but I would imagine that they feel chosen by God to run Afghanistan and to subjugate women, subjugate Christians, and to commit acts of real violence against other people because they are chosen and you're not.
Right.
And that to me is really also at the heart of religious violence, this ideology of chosenness, which is absolutely wrong. I mean, it's based on pure fantasy. Now, you could, as a Christian, you could easily point out many scriptures in the Bible that talk about how God chooses certain people and does not choose others. And those who are chosen, think about Saul and his improprieties, or David and his improprieties. You know, it didn't matter the horrible things that they did because they were chosen. And you couldn't touch the Lord's anointed because they're chosen. And that same, frankly, horrific theology born out of ancient Judaism, ancient Hebrew writings, was passed on into the church. We find it in Paul, and it's been passed on to Christians today. And it's absolutely at the heart of a lot of religious violence.
It always catches my attention when I go back to see World War II documentaries, and even I remember seeing a time when Churchill and Roosevelt met together in the North Atlantic on ships, and they met their navies met together, and they had a joint worship service and singing "Onward, Christian Soldiers" together on that ship. You know, creating the mythology that what was happening, and I think any of us would say if there was a moral war that we're involved in, not that any war may be moral, but you know, trying to end Nazism was probably the most noble of the causes that we've been involved in. Nevertheless, to equate it with Christian crusadism in singing hymns is kind of turns my stomach. And again, you see the use of the Christian framework to justify violent behavior.
This idea of chosenness that Aaron, you mentioned earlier, does pave the way for pure, unadulterated power, control, the ability to act without accountability. I see that played out in radicalized faith and in fundamentalist circles. When you finally have the power, due to perhaps your sense of chosenness, you do have the power and you do have the authority to do what you think is best or right, however twisted your belief might be. It becomes completely antithetical to what Jesus of Nazareth would have taught in relationship to power being characterized in humility, being characterized in mutuality, and being characterized in service to others. When you sense what's happening with power and authority from a geopolitical perspective or a radicalized faith perspective or a fundamentalist perspective, you know, it's always about chopping off the heads, right? Either literally, how we've seen the Taliban dismember people publicly, or symbolically through other kinds of dismemberment, of using policies, politics, rules and regs, using platforms to demoralize and dismember humanity in so many ways. But it's all antithetical to what Jesus said was the true essence of power, the power that is in humility and mutuality and service to others.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great point, Shane. Understanding that the so-called ultimate chosen one, Jesus of Nazareth, did not take his chosenness, so to speak, as an opportunity to assert dominance and control and power but as an opportunity to become the servant of all. This is what I think that's absolutely a powerful idea that I have not fleshed out yet, but I will for Sunday. But this idea that chosenness, the kind of chosenness we're to embody looks like, Christ's kind of chosenness, which means you're chosen to lay your life down and to empty yourself out on behalf of others for the cause of love and justice in the world. It's not about you. I think that's what's really powerful in the Christian message about chosenness, and that's radical, right? And I think that's even contrary to even some Pauline theology, because Paul believed, this Jesus who laid his life down for others, this Jesus who forgave his enemies, even while they were crucifying him, this same Jesus is coming back in glory and power with a sword in his hand, no longer forgiving his enemies at all, but he is going to pour out his wrath on his enemies and make them rue the day they were born. I think that is a complete misunderstanding of the cross and the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
The crucified God, the crucified Christ, was not coming back to punish his enemies. This is completely antithetical to who he was, and to his understanding of power and strength, which is about love and justice and mercy and sacrifice. So that's really an interesting. Thank you for bringing that up, Shane. You've given me notes for Sunday.
Well, I think what you bring up, Aaron, is so good. Is it didn't take Christianity very long to put a sword in Christ's hand. We didn't wait. He was the suffering servant for maybe less, for 60, 70 years. And then we started giving him weapons and giving him power and turning him into something that he'd never intended to be and that never spoke about in his ministry. And it is so hard to not find a reason to pick up a sword in the sake of bringing about the kingdom that we want right now through force, righteous force that we believe this time it will be righteous. And I think, unfortunately we're seeing too many examples, and we even see it in the way our own country exercises foreign policy. Is we believe we have righteous reasons for exercising force in the world, and again we see the fallacy of force accomplishing righteous means.
Again, images are extremely powerful. And when on one day you see Taliban flags flying in Afghanistan, white flags with black lettering, easily identifiable. On a previous day, you saw wooden crosses being carried at the United States Capitol. So when you see Taliban flags in Afghanistan and you see wooden crosses on January the 6th, both of those symbols are the same, because they both are being held in the hearts and the hands of radicalized faith, radicalized fundamentalism, and radicalized people. There's no difference between the two. Right. They're equal and they are the same. And they come out of the same wellspring of the spirit.
We watched the Taliban wait out 20 years of American occupation in Afghanistan. We're watching a rising American fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism. What is the antidote? Certainly the antidote is not a counter violence.
No. Well, isn't it interesting, to the degree that we might know the characters who followed Jesus and their backgrounds or who they were as people, but isn't it interesting that it could be very probable that there were those in Jesus' closest inner circle of followers who they themselves would have hoisted the Taliban flag and would have hoisted the wooden cross, the flag in Afghanistan, the cross at the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. Jesus had in his inner circle, had people who would have taken those routes. And they came because they came out of those mentalities. When Jesus invited them to come and be with him, he was inviting them to come knowing that they had those mentalities and that they had those instincts.
Right.
Yeah, and yet Jesus went into the temple and flipped over the money changers' tables
Yeah.
and drove out the merchants who were essentially thieves, and he did so by physical acts that intimidated and drove them out. You
Yes.
know, I don't think we can draw a neat line here and say all acts of violence for the sake of justice. You know, and Todd, you rightly brought up World War II and the Allies and just war theory about World War II. I'm right there with you. I'm not a big rah World War II person, but I do tend to believe that there are forms of justifiable physical violence in the name of stopping evil. I'm not naive that evil would love nothing more, and evil people would love nothing more than for us to believe that if we're just nice to them and loving, that they will change. But I'm very, very concerned about making those judgment calls, and perhaps lucky for me, it's above my pay grade that I don't sit in the I don't have to sit in an office and make those decisions for the military or something. You know what I mean? But nevertheless, those are questions that do worry me. But they're not easy. I'm just simply saying it's more complex, even from a Christian point, even from a gospel point of view. Jesus actually did, right? Or at least what we're told what he did, right? I want to make sure we distance ourselves a little bit from that. But I can't help but think that part of what we saw on January 6th, or in large part what we saw on January 6th, and in large part what we're seeing from the radicalized militant parts of the Islamic world, is a reaction to the death throes of these worldviews, that because of modernity and secularization around the world, we are seeing a reactionary element coming out of the right. And by the right, I mean both out of Islam on the right and evangelicalism, that is getting increasingly more violent because they realize that they're losing relevancy, they're losing power. And my hope is that in a few generations, these violent religious elements will be even more diminished in power and more marginalized, and not able to win elections or to control entire nation states like Afghanistan. But I don't know, right? And if anything, the last 30 years has taught us is don't count out religious fundamentalism and its ability to grip people. And if Germany during the Weimar Republic in the 1930s and the rise of National Social Hitler in Germany in the 1930s teaches anything, that people in tough times crave fascism because it provides easy answers and it provides certainty, and people crave that stuff like a drug addict. So I'm optimistic that secularization and modernity and the so-called death of God, which I'm putting in quotation marks because I think that's a very Christological idea, the death of our idols, the death of any religious ideology that allows us to escape the world. I have hope that secularization, modernity, and the death of God will become more of a reality and set people free from these horrific expressions of religion.
Thanks for listening. We'd love to get your feedback on today's conversation. Please email us at uncollaredpodcast@gmail.com. You can find Uncollared wherever you get your podcasts, including Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. You can watch the podcast on YouTube. And please follow us on Facebook, Instagram,